The morning sun cast long shadows across the Norfolk Naval Base as Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez stepped off the transport plane. After 3 grueling deployments in Afghanistan, she was finally home. The Virginia air felt different, somehow cleaner, lighter, without the constant smell of dust and diesel that had filled her lungs for the past 18 months. As she walked across the tarmac with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, Rebecca caught sight of the crowd gathering near the main building. Families held welcome home banners, children clutched small American flags, and wives wiped tears from their eyes as they scanned the returning soldiers for familiar faces. The scene should have filled her with joy, but instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as if she was watching everything happen to someone else. Rebecca had always been the kind of person who could handle anything life threw at her. Growing up in a small Texas town, she learned early that crying didn't fix problems and complaining didn't change circumstances. When she joined the Navy at 19, her drill instructors noticed something special about her: a calm determination that never seemed to crack, even under the most intense pressure. That strength had served her well overseas. As a combat medic, she had seen things that would break most people. She had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, performed emergency surgery in makeshift field hospitals while mortars exploded nearby, and held the hands of dying young men who called out for their mothers in their final moments. Through it all, she had remained steady, focused, unbreakable. Or so everyone believed. The truth was that each mission had chipped away at something inside her, something she couldn't quite name or understand. It started small: a slight hesitation before entering a building, a moment of panic when she heard loud noises, difficulty sleeping through the night. But Rebecca had pushed these feelings down, buried them under layers of duty and responsibility. There was no time for weakness when lives depended on her steady hands and clear thinking. Now, as she approached the ceremony area, Rebecca forced herself to stand straighter, to put on the face everyone expected to see. She was a hero after all. The silver star pinned to her dress uniform proved it. The 3 Purple Hearts spoke to her sacrifice. The commendations from her commanding officers praised her courage under fire. Admiral Patricia Harrison stood at the podium, her gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her uniform crisp and decorated with ribbons earned over 30 years of service. She was known throughout the base as a tough but fair leader, someone who had broken barriers for women in the military and demanded excellence from everyone under her command. As Admiral Harrison began reading the names of returning personnel, Rebecca found herself scanning the crowd. She spotted other military families, their faces glowing with pride and relief. There were grandparents holding signs, teenagers fidgeting in their best clothes, and small children who had grown taller during their parents' absence. But Rebecca's own family wasn't there. Her parents had wanted to come, had begged her to let them make the trip from Texas, but she had talked them out of it. She told them it wasn't necessary, that she preferred quiet homecomings. The real reason was more complicated. She wasn't sure she could handle their questions, their concern, their attempts to understand what she had been through. How could she explain the weight she carried when she didn't fully understand it herself? When her name was called, Rebecca walked to the front with the same measured steps she had used to approach wounded soldiers in the field. The crowd applauded, but the sound seemed muffled, distant. Admiral Harrison shook her hand and said something about exceptional service and dedication, but Rebecca barely heard the words. She was too focused on maintaining her composure, on not letting anyone see the cracks that were starting to show. The medal ceremony felt like it lasted forever. As Rebecca stood at attention, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was pretending to be someone she used to be. The confident, unflappable medic everyone was honoring felt like a character she had once played, not the person she actually was anymore. During her final deployment, there had been an incident that changed everything. An improvised explosive device had detonated near the medical tent where Rebecca was treating wounded soldiers. The blast had thrown her across the room, cracking 2 ribs and leaving deep gashes along her side. But the physical injuries weren't the worst part. In the chaos that followed, Rebecca had been unable to save a young soldier who had been brought in just minutes before the explosion. Private Johnson, barely 20 years old, with kind eyes and a picture of his girlfriend tucked into his helmet, He had been talking to Rebecca about his plans to propose when he got home, showing her the ring he kept in a small box in his pocket. After the blast, as Rebecca lay on the ground struggling to breathe, she had watched helplessly as Johnson bled out just a few feet away. She could hear him calling for help, could see his hand reaching toward her, but she couldn't move. By the time other medics reached them both, it was too late. That image haunted her now. In quiet moments, she could still hear Johnson's voice, still see his face. The guilt ate at her insides like acid. She had been trained to save lives, had dedicated herself to healing others, and when it mattered most, she had failed. But standing on that platform, accepting congratulations and accolades, Rebecca couldn't voice any of these thoughts. Everyone saw her as a success story, a shining example of military excellence. How could she tell them that some nights she woke up screaming, that loud noises made her dive for cover, that she sometimes found herself checking and rechecking locks on doors, unable to feel safe even in her own temporary quarters? As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Rebecca found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Fellow officers shook her hand and thanked her for her service. Civilian employees from the base expressed their gratitude. Everyone wanted to know about her experiences, wanted to hear war stories, wanted to understand what it was like over there. Rebecca gave them the answers they expected. She talked about the satisfaction of helping wounded soldiers, the bonds formed with fellow service members, the honor of serving her country. She smiled at the right moments and nodded when people called her brave. But inside, she felt like a fraud. The hardest part was that she wanted to feel proud. She wanted to embrace the recognition and celebrate her accomplishments. These people weren't wrong. She had done extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. She had saved lives and served with distinction. But somehow, all of that felt overshadowed by the faces she couldn't save. The moments when her best efforts hadn't been enough. As the crowd finally began to thin, Rebecca made her excuses and headed toward the parking lot where a taxi was waiting to take her to temporary housing. She had 6 weeks of leave before her next assignment, 6 weeks to rest and recover and prepare for whatever came next. But as she climbed into the back seat and gave the driver an address, Rebecca realized she had no idea how to rest. For the past several years, her life had been structured around duty and mission. Every day had clear objectives and defined purposes. Now, faced with unstructured time and no immediate responsibilities, she felt lost. The taxi pulled away from the base, carrying her toward an uncertain future. Behind her, the flag still flew, and the building stood strong, symbols of service and sacrifice. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something important behind, something she might never be able to get back. 6 months had passed since Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez walked off that transport plane, and the hero's welcome felt like a distant memory. The temporary housing had become permanent, a small apartment just outside the naval base where she now worked in the medical facility. Every morning, she put on her uniform, straightened her shoulders, and tried to be the same person everyone expected her to be. But something was wrong, and it was getting worse. It started with small things that Rebecca told herself were normal adjustments. The first week back, she had jumped when a door slammed in the medical wing. Nothing unusual about that, she reasoned. Anyone would be startled by a loud noise. When she found herself checking the locks on her apartment door 3 times before bed, she explained it away as being careful in a new neighborhood. The real problems began during her first shift in the base hospital. Rebecca was assigned to the emergency department, a natural fit given her field experience. The chief medical officer had personally requested her, excited to have someone with her background on the team. "Your combat experience will be invaluable here," he had said during her orientation. These young medics could learn a lot from someone who's seen real action. Rebecca had nodded and smiled, but inside, she felt a growing dread. The sterile hospital environment, so different from the dusty field stations she was used to, somehow felt more threatening. The bright fluorescent lights reminded her of the emergency lighting that would kick on during attacks. The rhythmic beeping of monitors sounded too much like the timing devices she had learned to fear during her first emergency case. a construction worker came in with severe lacerations from a workplace accident. The sight of blood, which had never bothered Rebecca before, made her hands shake slightly as she prepared the suturing materials. She managed to complete the procedure successfully, but afterward, she locked herself in a supply closet and took deep breaths until her heart stopped racing. The episodes became more frequent. A patient came in with blast injuries from a car accident, and Rebecca froze completely for nearly 30 seconds before another nurse had to step in. She covered by claiming she was assessing the situation, but her supervisor noticed the delay. During a trauma drill, the sound of the emergency alarm sent her into such a panic that she had to excuse herself to vomit in the bathroom. Rebecca's colleagues began to notice changes too, though they attributed them to different causes. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, her direct supervisor, mentioned that she seemed distracted during briefings. "Maybe you need more time to adjust to stateside medicine," he suggested kindly. "Field work is different from hospital work. Take your time finding your rhythm." But Rebecca knew it wasn't about adjusting to hospital procedures. She could perform the medical tasks perfectly when her mind was clear. The problem was that her mind was rarely clear anymore. Images from her deployments would flash through her consciousness at the worst possible moments. The face of Private Johnson, the young soldier she couldn't save, appeared to her constantly. Sometimes she would catch herself looking for him among the patients, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. Sleep became increasingly elusive. Rebecca would lie in bed, exhausted from her shifts, but every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that medical tent. She could smell the dust and diesel fuel, hear the distant sound of helicopters, feel the ground shake from explosions. She tried sleeping pills, warm milk, meditation apps, but nothing worked for long. The worst part was the isolation. Rebecca had always been social, someone who made friends easily and enjoyed the camaraderie of military life. But now she found herself avoiding the officers' club, declining invitations to barbecues and birthday parties. When her colleagues asked if she wanted to grab dinner or see a movie, she always had an excuse. Too tired, too much paperwork, plans with family that didn't actually exist. Dr. Jennifer Kim, a Navy psychiatrist who worked in the same building, had tried several times to strike up conversations with Rebecca. Dr. Kim was known for her work with returning veterans, and she had a gentle way of making people feel comfortable. But Rebecca instinctively avoided her, sensing that Dr. Kim could see through the facade she worked so hard to maintain. 3 months into her assignment, Rebecca's performance reviews started reflecting her struggles. Her medical skills remained excellent, but there were concerns about her reliability and focus. She had missed 2 morning briefings after oversleeping, something that had never happened in her entire military career. Her paperwork, once meticulous, now contained small errors and omissions. Lieutenant Commander Walsh called her into his office on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Rebecca sat across from his desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, waiting for what she knew was coming. "Rebecca, I'm concerned about you," Walsh began, his voice gentle but serious. "Your technical skills are as sharp as ever, but you seem different. Is everything all right at home? Any family issues we should know about?" Rebecca gave him the same answer she gave everyone. Everything was fine. Just adjusting to being back. Maybe a little tired from the transition. Nothing that time wouldn't fix. Walsh studied her face for a long moment. He had served for 22 years and had seen his share of soldiers struggling with invisible wounds. But he also knew that you couldn't force someone to accept help they weren't ready to receive. "I want you to know that resources are available if you need them," he said carefully. "The base has excellent counseling services, support groups, medical options. There's no shame in using them." Rebecca thanked him politely and assured him that she was managing fine. But as she left his office, she felt a crushing weight of failure. She was supposed to be strong, reliable, unbreakable. The medals on her uniform represented her ability to handle anything. Yet here she was, falling apart during routine hospital shifts. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine training exercise. The base was conducting a mass casualty drill, simulating a terrorist attack on a nearby shopping center. Rebecca had participated in dozens of similar exercises during her career, both in training and in real situations overseas. But as the simulation began, with actors playing wounded civilians and the sound of blank ammunition being fired, something inside Rebecca snapped. The moment she heard the first simulated gunshot, she was no longer at Norfolk Naval Base. She was back in Afghanistan, back in that medical tent, back in the moment when everything went wrong. The panic attack hit her like a physical blow. Her chest tightened until she couldn't breathe, her vision blurred, and her hands began clawing at her uniform as if trying to escape from her own skin. The scars on her ribs, which had healed months ago, suddenly burned with fresh pain. She stumbled away from the exercise area, seeking shelter behind a supply truck. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The world spun around her as she scratched at her chest, reopening small cuts where her fingernails dug into old scar tissue. The last thing she remembered was the sound of footsteps running toward her and voices calling for a medical team. Then everything went black. When Rebecca woke up in the base hospital, she found herself in a private room with an IV in her arm and monitoring equipment beeping softly nearby. Dr. Kim sat in a chair beside the bed, reading through a chart with a concerned expression. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Kim asked when she noticed Rebecca was awake. Rebecca tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her back onto the pillow. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though her voice was hoarse and her hands were bandaged where she had scratched herself. "Doctor." Kim set down the chart and leaned forward slightly. "Rebecca, you had a severe panic attack during the training exercise. Your colleagues found you unconscious behind the supply truck. This isn't something you can just push through." But Rebecca was already building her defenses, already preparing the explanations that would make this incident seem like an isolated occurrence. She was a decorated veteran, a skilled medic, a person who saved lives. She couldn't be the kind of person who fell apart during training exercises. As Dr. Kim continued talking about treatment options and recovery plans, Rebecca stared at the ceiling and wondered how she had gotten to this point. 6 months ago, she had been receiving medals and accolades. Now, she was lying in a hospital bed, officially labeled as someone who couldn't handle the job she had trained her entire adult life to do. The worst part was the shame. Not just the embarrassment of having a public breakdown, but the deeper shame of feeling weak, of being unable to control her own mind and body. Rebecca had always defined herself by her strength and competence. Without those qualities, she wasn't sure who she was supposed to be. The medical leave papers sat on Rebecca's kitchen table like an accusation. Temporary fitness for duty suspension pending psychological evaluation, they read in cold, official language. 2 weeks had passed since the incident during the training exercise, and those words had become the soundtrack to her daily shame. Her apartment, once a temporary refuge, had transformed into a prison. The blinds stayed drawn 24 hours a day, blocking out the Virginia sunshine that used to energize her. The space that had once been neat and military precise now reflected the chaos in her mind. Empty takeout containers stacked on the counter, an open mail scattered across the coffee table, and laundry piled in corners where she had dropped it days ago. Rebecca spent most of her time on the couch, wrapped in an old navy blanket her mother had sent during her first deployment. The television played constant background noise, mindless daytime shows, old movies, news programs she couldn't really follow. She kept the volume low, just loud enough to drown out the silence, but not so loud that sudden sound effects might trigger another episode. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, mostly empty except for leftover Chinese food and a few bottles of water. Eating had become a chore she forgot about until her stomach cramped with hunger. Even then, she often settled for whatever could be delivered, too exhausted by the simple act of existing to consider cooking. Sleep remained elusive, but in a different way than before. Instead of lying awake for hours, Rebecca now found herself dozing fitfully throughout the day, catching fragments of rest between nightmares. She would wake on the couch at odd hours, 3 in the afternoon, 7 in the evening, 2 in the morning, disoriented and unsure how long she had been unconscious. The worst part was the silence in her own head. For years, Rebecca's mind had been a place of constant activity, analyzing situations, making medical decisions, planning her next move. Now, it felt empty and echoing, like a house where all the furniture had been removed. When thoughts did surface, they were usually dark and circular, returning again and again to the same themes of failure and inadequacy. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages she couldn't bring herself to answer. Her parents called every few days, their voices bright with forced cheerfulness as they left voicemails asking how she was adjusting to life back home. Her father, a Vietnam veteran himself, tried to sound casual when he mentioned that he was always available to talk about anything. Her mother sent text messages with heart emojis and photos of the family dog, trying to maintain their normal rhythm of communication. Rebecca's younger brother Tony, a college senior studying engineering, had started sending her funny memes and videos, clearly trying to lift her spirits. His messages were the hardest to ignore because she could picture him in his dorm room, worried about his big sister but unsure how to help. She had always been his hero, the family member who had found her calling and succeeded at everything she attempted. Former colleagues from the base reached out too. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had called twice, both times leaving professional but concerned messages about her medical leave and return timeline. A few of the nurses from her unit had sent group text messages about getting together for dinner or drinks. Dr. Kim, the Navy psychiatrist, had left a voicemail explaining that she was available whenever Rebecca felt ready to talk. Each unanswered message felt like another small betrayal, another relationship she was damaging through her inability to function normally. But the thought of picking up the phone, of having to pretend she was okay or explain why she wasn't, seemed impossibly overwhelming. It was easier to let the calls go to voicemail and the texts pile up unread. The scars on her ribs had become a focal point for Rebecca's self-loathing. She found herself touching them constantly, tracing the jagged lines with her fingertips as if they might tell her something she didn't already know. The physical wounds had healed completely, the doctors had done excellent work, and barely any evidence remained of how close she had come to dying in that explosion. But Rebecca had begun to see those scars differently. Where doctors saw successful healing, she saw proof of her weakness. A stronger person wouldn't have been thrown by the blast. A better medic would have been able to save Private Johnson even while injured. A real soldier would have bounced back from the trauma instead of falling apart months later during a routine training exercise. She spent hours studying her reflection in the bathroom mirror, lifting her shirt to examine the faded marks. The scars weren't particularly dramatic, thin white lines against her olive skin, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. But to Rebecca, they represented everything wrong with her current situation. She was damaged goods, broken in ways that couldn't be fixed with surgery or medication. The prescription bottles Dr. Kim had given her sat unopened on the kitchen counter like small monuments to her stubbornness. Anti-anxiety medication, sleep aids, antidepressants, all of them representing an admission that she couldn't handle her problems on her own. Rebecca had built her entire identity around being self-sufficient, around being the person others turned to for help. Taking medication felt like giving up, like admitting that she was fundamentally flawed. She had researched the drugs online, reading about side effects and success rates, user reviews, and medical studies. The information was encouraging these medications helped many people function normally again. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that needing chemical assistance to think clearly or sleep through the night made her weak. Her days blended together without structure or purpose. She would wake up whenever her body decided to stop pretending to rest, spend a few minutes remembering where she was and why she wasn't at work, then settle into another day of existing without living. Sometimes she tried to read. She had always loved mystery novels and military biographies, but the words seemed to slide off the page without meaning. Television was easier because it required no active participation. She found herself drawn to cooking shows and home improvement programs, watching other people create and build and fix things while she sat motionless on her couch. The cheerful hosts seemed to exist in a different universe, one where problems had solutions and effort led to visible results. The isolation was the hardest part. Rebecca had never realized how much of her identity was tied to being useful to other people. In the military, she had always been needed by wounded soldiers, by commanding officers, by fellow medics who looked up to her experience. Now, removed from that environment, she felt invisible and purposeless. She tried to remember what she used to enjoy before the military, but that version of herself seemed like a stranger. Had she ever just relaxed without feeling guilty? Had she ever spent a day without a clear mission or objective? Her teenage years felt like ancient history, and her early 20s had been consumed by training and deployment cycles. Sometimes, Rebecca would catch herself staring at her uniforms hanging in the closet, still pressed and ready for duty. The ribbons and medals told the story of a successful career, of a person who had made a difference in the world. But that person felt as distant as a character in a book she had once read. The neighbors in her apartment complex went about their daily routines, leaving for work in the morning, returning with groceries in the evening, walking their dogs, and checking their mail. Through her window, Rebecca could see fragments of normal life continuing around her. Children played in the courtyard, couples held hands on their way to dinner, elderly residents tended small gardens outside their doors. She wondered if any of them knew that a decorated veteran was falling apart just a few feet away from their ordinary lives. Would they care if they knew? Would they understand? Or would they see her struggles as evidence of weakness? Rebecca had always assumed that civilians expected military personnel to be strong and resilient. The thought of disappointing those expectations added another layer to her shame. Admiral Patricia Harrison sat in her office on the 5th floor of the administration building, staring at a file that had been troubling her for days. Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez's personnel record lay open on her desk, filled with commendations, medical reports, and now, worrying gaps where scheduled appointments had been missed. The Admiral had built her career on making tough decisions, but this situation felt different. She had watched too many good soldiers slip through the cracks of a system that wasn't always equipped to handle invisible wounds. Rebecca's case reminded her of her own struggles decades earlier, when seeking help for psychological trauma was seen as career suicide rather than necessary medical care. For 3 days, Rebecca had failed to report for her mandatory fitness for duty evaluation. Her phone calls went unanswered, and emails bounced back with automated responses. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had expressed his concerns during their morning briefing, noting that this behavior was completely out of character for someone with Rebecca's previously spotless record. "She's isolating herself," Walsh had said, his voice heavy with worry. "I've seen this pattern before. The longer we wait, the harder it becomes to reach them." Admiral Harrison knew he was right. In her 30 years of service, she had seen too many promising careers, and not in dramatic fashion, but in quiet desperation. The strong ones often fell the hardest because they had the furthest to go before anyone noticed they were struggling. That Thursday morning, she made a decision that would have surprised her younger self. Instead of sending another official summons or dispatching a junior officer to check on Rebecca, Admiral Harrison decided to make the visit personally. She changed out of her dress uniform into casual civilian clothes, khakis, and a simple blue sweater that made her look more like someone's aunt than a high-ranking military officer. The drive to Rebecca's apartment complex took 20 minutes through the Virginia suburbs. Admiral Harrison had made this kind of intervention only twice before in her career, both times successfully, though she understood that personal visits from flag officers could be overwhelming rather than helpful. But something about Rebecca's situation felt urgent in a way that couldn't wait for proper channels and scheduled appointments. The apartment complex was modest, but well maintained, the kind of place where young military families and single officers often lived while stationed. At Norfolk, Admiral Harrison found Building C and climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, her civilian shoes quiet on the metal steps. She paused outside apartment to B, noting the absence of any personal touches on the door. No nameplate, no welcome mat, no signs that anyone actually lived there. When she knocked, there was no immediate response. She could hear movement inside, the sound of footsteps, and what might have been someone moving around furniture. After a long moment, she heard Rebecca's voice through the door, muffled and cautious. "Who is it?" It's Admiral Harrison. I'd like to speak with you, Rebecca. The silence that followed stretched so long that the Admiral wondered if Rebecca had simply walked away from the door. But eventually, she heard the sound of multiple locks being undone, and the door opened just wide enough to reveal Rebecca's face. The change was shocking. The confident, polished officer Admiral Harrison remembered from the homecoming ceremony 6 months ago was barely recognizable. Rebecca's hair, once always perfectly styled according to military regulations, hung loose and unwashed around her shoulders. She wore civilian clothes that looked like they had been slept in, an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants that emphasized how much weight she had lost. But it was Rebecca's eyes that concerned the Admiral most. They held a wariness that reminded her of wounded animals, constantly scanning for threats and escape routes. The spark of intelligence and determination that had once defined her was barely visible beneath layers of exhaustion and shame. "Admiral," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't expecting. May I come in? I'd like to talk with you." Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn between military protocol that demanded respect for superior officers and a deep desire to hide from anyone who might see her current state. Eventually, she stepped back and opened the door wider, though she kept her eyes focused on the floor. The apartment told its own story. What had once been a neat, orderly space now looked like someone was either moving out or had given up on basic maintenance. Takeout containers covered the coffee table, an open mail was scattered across surfaces, and blackout curtains blocked any natural light from entering. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the smell of neglect and isolation. Admiral Harrison had seen similar living conditions before, usually in the homes of veterans who had lost their way after leaving the service. But seeing it here, in the home of an officer who had been thriving just months ago, drove home how quickly things could deteriorate when the right support wasn't available. Rebecca moved around the small space with nervous energy, gathering up obvious trash and trying to create some semblance of order. Her movements were quick and jerky, like someone who had been caught doing something wrong and was trying to cover the evidence. "I'm sorry about the mess," Rebecca said, not looking directly at the Admiral. I didn't know anyone was coming. If you had called." "I did call," Admiral Harrison said gently, settling into the only chair that wasn't covered with debris. "Several times. Your phone seems to be going straight to voicemail." Rebecca's face flushed with embarrassment. She had been ignoring her phone for so long that the battery had died days ago, and she hadn't bothered to charge it. The outside world had started to feel like something that happened to other people, not something she needed to participate in. "I've been having some technical difficulties," Rebecca said, the lie obvious to both of them. "But I'm fine. Really. I know I missed the appointment, but I've just been dealing with some personal issues. Nothing that affects my ability to serve." Admiral Harrison studied Rebecca's face as she spoke, noting the way her eyes darted around the room, never settling on any one thing for more than a second. Her hands moved constantly, adjusting her shirt, running through her hair, picking up and putting down objects without any apparent purpose. "Rebecca, when was the last time you left this apartment?" The question seemed to catch Rebecca off guard. She opened her mouth as if to answer, then closed it again, apparently realizing she couldn't remember. Days had blended together in a haze of insomnia and anxiety. Had it been a week? 2 weeks? The trip to get groceries felt like it had happened in another lifetime. "Been resting," Rebecca said finally. "The doctors said I needed rest." "And have you been following their other recommendations? Taking the medications they prescribed?" Rebecca's eyes flicked toward the kitchen counter where the unopened prescription bottles sat like evidence of her failure to take care of herself. She had rehearsed explanations for this moment, reasons why she didn't need chemical assistance to function normally. But standing in front of Admiral Harrison, with the reality of her living situation impossible to hide, those explanations felt hollow. "I don't need pills to be okay," Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength as she found familiar ground. "I've always handled things on my own. I just need some time to get back to normal." Admiral Harrison recognized the tone. It was the same one she had used decades earlier when her own commanding officers had suggested she seek help for her struggles. The military taught people to be self-reliant, to solve problems through discipline and determination. But some problems required different solutions. What does normal look like to you right now? The Admiral asked. The question hung in the air. Between them, Rebecca started to give another automatic response about being ready to return to duty, but the words died in her throat. Normal had become a foreign concept. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly okay, truly like herself. I can do my job, she said instead, falling back on the one thing that had always defined her worth. I'm a good medic. I save lives. That's what matters. I know you're a good medic, Admiral Harrison said. Your record speaks for itself. But right now I'm not concerned about your professional abilities. I'm concerned about you as a person. The kindness in her voice nearly broke through Rebecca's defenses. For months, every interaction had felt like a performance, a test she had to pass to prove she was still the person everyone expected her to be. But Admiral Harrison wasn't asking her to perform. She was simply acknowledging that Rebecca was struggling and that it mattered. I don't know how to not be okay, Rebecca admitted, the words coming out before she could stop them. Everyone sees me as this strong person who can handle anything, but I can't even handle getting dressed in the morning anymore. Admiral Harrison leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle but focused. Strength isn't about never falling down, Rebecca. It's about what you do when you find yourself on the ground. The words hung between them like a challenge Rebecca couldn't ignore. Admiral Harrison's gentle observation about strength had touched something deep inside her, something she had been trying to bury for months. But instead of feeling comforted, Rebecca felt exposed, as if her carefully constructed walls were crumbling without her permission. You don't understand, Rebecca said, her voice rising with desperation. I can't be the kind of person who needs help. That's not who I am. That's not who I've ever been. She began pacing the small living room, her movements becoming more agitated with each step. The Admiral watched quietly, recognizing the signs of someone approaching a breaking point. Rebecca's hands gestured wildly as she spoke, as if she could somehow convince both of them that everything was under control. I've been taking care of other people my whole life, Rebecca continued, her words coming faster now. In high school, I was the one my friends came to when they had problems. In basic training, I helped the ones who were struggling. Overseas, I saved lives. That's what I do. I fix things. I don't fall apart. Admiral Harrison remained seated, her posture calm and non-threatening. She had learned long ago that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone in crisis was simply to witness their pain without trying to fix it immediately. I keep thinking about this one soldier, Rebecca said, stopping her pacing to stare out the covered window. Private Johnson. He was barely 20 years old. Had this girlfriend back home he was planning to marry. He showed me her picture every time he came to the medical tent for the smallest thing. A cut on his hand, a headache, whatever excuse he could find just to talk to someone. Her voice grew quieter, more distant, as if she was seeing something the Admiral couldn't see. The day the light went off, he had come in because he was worried about a rash on his arm. Probably just heat rash from wearing his gear too long. Nothing serious. But he was nervous about it. Thought maybe it was infected. I was cleaning it when the explosion happened. Rebecca's hands unconsciously moved to her ribs, pressing against the fabric of her t-shirt where the scars lay hidden underneath. When I woke up, I was on the ground, couldn't breathe properly, ribs all messed up. And Johnson was right there, maybe 6 feet away, calling for help. He was hurt worse than me, bleeding from somewhere I couldn't see. But I couldn't move. I couldn't move. Admiral Harrison felt her heart clench with recognition. She had carried her own version of this story for over 20 years. Her own moment when being human had felt like failure. I watched him die, Rebecca said simply. I listened to him call for his girlfriend, for his mom, for anyone. And I couldn't help him. The one time it really mattered, when someone needed me most, I failed. Rebecca, Admiral Harrison said gently, you were injured. You had broken ribs and internal bleeding. The medical report said you nearly died yourself. But Rebecca shook her head violently, as if the Admiral's words were physically painful to hear. That's what everyone keeps saying, that I was hurt. That I did my best, that it wasn't my fault. But they don't understand. I'm supposed to be stronger than that. I'm supposed to be able to push through anything. She turned away from the window and faced the Admiral directly for the first time since she had arrived. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her jaw was set with the same determination that had carried her through 3 deployments. I can prove it to you, Rebecca said suddenly. I can prove that I'm ready to go back to work, that I'm not broken. Before Admiral Harrison could respond, Rebecca reached for the hem of her t-shirt and began to lift it, revealing her torso. The movement was swift and desperate, like someone making a last-ditch effort to save themselves from drowning. Ugh, Rebecca said, her voice cracking with emotion. The scars are completely healed. See? The doctors did a great job. You can barely even tell I was hurt. Admiral Harrison's breath caught in her throat as she saw the network of thin white lines that crisscrossed Rebecca's ribs. The scars were indeed well healed, barely visible against her skin. But that wasn't what made the Admiral fall silent. It was the desperate hope in Rebecca's eyes as she displayed her wounds like badges of honor. It was the way she held her shirt up with shaking hands, as if these faded marks could somehow prove her worthiness. It was the heartbreaking belief that physical healing meant emotional healing, that visible recovery meant invisible recovery. I'm not broken, Rebecca repeated, her voice barely above a whisper now. I can do my job. I can take care of people. I just need everyone to stop treating me like I'm fragile. But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca's composure began to crumble. The act of revealing her scars had taken more out of her than she expected. Standing there, exposed and vulnerable, she felt more broken than ever. Admiral Harrison rose slowly from her chair and approached Rebecca with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. She had seen many displays of courage in her career, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about this moment, a decorated veteran so desperate to prove her strength that she was willing to bear her deepest vulnerabilities. Rebecca, the Admiral said softly, those scars don't make you weak. They make you a survivor. Rebecca's hands were still holding up her shirt, but she was staring down at the floor now, unable to meet the Admiral's eyes. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of pain and misunderstanding. But they're not the scars that are causing you problems, are they? Admiral Harrison continued. The ones that are hurting you are the ones no one can see. And with those words, something inside Rebecca finally broke open. The tears she had been holding back for months began to fall, quietly at first, then in great shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. She lowered her shirt and wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold all the broken pieces together. Admiral Harrison stepped closer and, after a moment's hesitation, put a gentle hand on Rebecca's shoulder. I carried a story like yours for 20 years, the Admiral said quietly. A young Marine under my command, killed in Beirut while I was safe in a bunker. I told myself I should have been there, should have saved him, should have been stronger. It nearly destroyed my career and my marriage before I finally accepted that being human doesn't make you weak. Rebecca looked up through her tears, seeing the Admiral not as a superior officer, but as someone who understood the weight she had been carrying. How do you live with it? Rebecca asked. How do you get up every day knowing you failed when it mattered most? Admiral Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. You learn that failure isn't the opposite of strength, it's part of it, she said finally. Every person who has ever done anything meaningful has failed at something important. The question isn't whether you'll fail, it is what you'll do with the failure. She moved to sit on the couch, patting the cushion beside her in invitation. Rebecca hesitated, then sat down, leaving space between them but no longer trying to hide. Those scars on your ribs tell a story of survival, Admiral Harrison continued. But the scars you can't see tell a story of caring so deeply about others that their pain becomes your pain. That's not weakness, Rebecca. That's what makes you exactly the kind of person we need in medicine. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing that would take much longer, but the possibility of healing. The beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this weight alone. I don't know how to not be Rebecca said again, But this time, it sounded less like a confession of failure and more like a request for help. Okay, Admiral Harrison replied. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. That's what the rest of us are here for. As they sat together in the dim apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Rebecca's struggle, both women understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The real work of healing would be long and difficult, but for the first time since that explosion in Afghanistan, Rebecca didn't feel like she had to face it alone. The scars on her ribs would always be there, thin white reminders of a day when everything changed. But maybe, Rebecca thought, they didn't have to define her. Maybe they could simply be part of a larger story, one that included falling down and getting back up, failing and trying again, being human and finding strength in that humanity rather than despite it.